I buried my son on a Tuesday. The weather didn't care. It was one of those bright Georgia mornings where the sky looks almost offensive, too blue, too clean, like the world hadn't gotten the memo that something had been taken from it. I stood at the graveside in my black dress with the buttons I could never fasten right, and I held Renata's hand. My daughter. She was shaking so hard I could feel it move up through my arm and into my chest. My son-in-law stood on her other side. Philip. He had his hand on the small of her back, and he kept rubbing circles like he was trying to comfort her. I watched him do it. I couldn't stop watching him. I didn't cry. Not once. Everyone kept glancing at me like they were waiting for it. The collapse, the wailing, the thing a mother is supposed to do when she puts her child in the ground. But I just stood there with the Georgia sun hitting the top of my head, and something cold sitting right in the center of my stomach. My son's name was Marcus Allen. He was 34 years old. He coached youth basketball at the rec center on Decatur Road. He made the best sweet potato pie I've ever tasted in my life, and he called me every Sunday at noon without fail for 11 years. The last call I got from him was on a Thursday. They said it was a heart attack. Some cardiac event, the medical examiner called it. No history of heart disease, no drugs in his system. He was found in the parking garage of the building where he worked, his company's office over near Midtown. Security found him slumped in the driver's seat at 6:47 in the morning. The car was still running. The detective who came to my house was kind enough. Young man, couldn't have been more than 30 himself. He sat at my kitchen table and told me these things gently, like he was packaging them so they wouldn't cut. He said it wasn't unusual for healthy men Marcus's age to just go like that, no warning. I nodded. I thanked him. I walked him to the door, and then I went back to my kitchen, and I stood at the sink and I thought about the last phone call. Marcus had called me on that Thursday evening, not Sunday. That alone was strange. He'd sounded distracted, not upset, not scared, just off. Like when you're trying to hold a conversation, but part of your brain is somewhere else entirely. He'd asked me how my hip was doing. He'd asked if I'd seen the news about the highway construction. And right before he hung up, he said something I'd turned over in my mind 100 times after. He said, "Mama, if anything ever happens to me, you look in my office, the top right drawer, okay?" I'd laughed. I'd said, "Boy, nothing's going to happen to you. Call me Sunday." He never called me Sunday. Philip arranged almost everything for the funeral. I let him, because Renata was in no condition, and because I told myself that's what good sons-in-law do. They step up, they handle the logistics, they make calls, they pick the casket when the widow can't stand up straight. But I kept watching him. The way he moved through those days. Too steady, too organized. Grief has a way of making people clumsy. They forget things, they lose the thread of conversations, they reach for phones to call the person who's gone and then remember. Philip didn't do any of that. He had a yellow legal pad, and he worked through it, like a checklist. I told myself I was being cruel. I told myself I was looking for somewhere to put my anger, and Philip was just close enough to catch it. I went back to my house after the reception, and I sat in the dark for a long time. It was 4 days after the funeral when my phone rang. Number I didn't recognize. Area code I didn't know. I almost didn't answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as the property manager for the building where Marcus had rented his apartment. He said his name was Owen. His voice was careful, the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. He told me he'd found something in Marcus's apartment while doing the walkthrough. Said it was in a storage locker in the basement of the building. A locker that only Marcus had the key to. He said he'd almost left it for building management to deal with, but something made him look up next of kin instead. He said, "Mrs. Allen, I think you need to come see this, and I need to ask you, please don't mention this to your son-in-law. Not yet. I have a reason for asking." My heart did something strange. I told him I'd be there in the morning. I drove alone. I didn't tell Renata where I was going. I told myself it was because she was fragile and I didn't want to get her hopes up over nothing. That was partly true. Owen met me in the lobby. He was older than I expected, maybe late 50s, with a kind of face that's been outside a lot. He shook my hand with both of his, and said he was sorry for my loss in a way that sounded like he meant it. He took me down 2 flights of stairs to the basement, row of storage units along a concrete corridor, the kind with wire mesh doors. He unlocked one near the end. Inside was a single plastic storage bin, the kind you get at Target. Grey lid, clear body. Inside the bin was a laptop computer, a manila envelope, a composition notebook, the black and white kind, and a prepaid cell phone still in the packaging. I stood there looking at it. Owen said, "I found this because I had to change the lock on that unit. Previous tenant left belongings, we had to clear it out. Marcus rented it afterward. When I opened it, the laptop was on. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I did, and I think you need to see what's on it." He powered up the laptop right there in that basement corridor. The folder on the desktop was labeled simply, "If." Inside was 3 subfolders. The first contained scanned documents, bank records, wire transfer receipts, audit reports from a company called Hargrove and Briggs Financial Solutions. Marcus had worked there for 6 years. He'd been their senior internal auditor. The second subfolder had photographs, printed documents photographed with his phone, slightly blurry at the edges but legible. They showed a pattern of transactions, money being moved from client accounts into a secondary LLC, small amounts at first, then larger ones, spread across 18 months. The total, as best I could calculate standing there in that basement, was somewhere close to $300,000. The name attached to the LLC appeared in 4 of the documents. Philip Hargrove, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, my son's colleague. I put my hand on the concrete wall. I opened the composition notebook that night, alone in my kitchen with the door locked. Marcus wrote the way he talked, in short, practical sentences. No drama, just facts and dates and questions he was working through. The first entry was from 8 months ago. Found the first discrepancy in the Meridian account. Small, could be an error. Flagging for review. 3 weeks later, not an error. Pulled the secondary reports. Someone's been running withdrawals through a vendor account that doesn't appear in any of our approved vendor lists. The LLC, Briggs Solutions Sub 2, was registered in Delaware 8 months before I found this. I know who has access to create vendor accounts in the system. There are 3 people. One of them is Philip. Further in, confronted him. Told him I had documentation and I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I went to compliance. He laughed, said I must be misreading the reports. Said we should have dinner, the 4 of us. Said Renata would love that restaurant in Buckhead. I had to stop reading. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. I sat at the table until the clock on the microwave read 2014 a.m. Then I kept reading. He came to my apartment last Tuesday night. I didn't let him in, but he stood in the hall and he was different. Not the person who laughs at dinner. He told me that what I thought I'd found wasn't what I thought it was, and that if I went forward with this, I would lose things I wasn't ready to lose. I don't know exactly what that means. I think it means Renata. I think it means he'd find a way to turn this into something about me. I'm scared. I won't write that anywhere else, but I'm writing it here. I'm going to put everything in storage. If something happens to me, Mama, it's Philip. That sentence was the last entry in the notebook. The date on it was 12 days before Marcus died in that parking garage. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years as a licensed social investigator for the state of Georgia. Child welfare cases, fraud investigation, family court liaison work. I have sat across the table from people who've done terrible things and I've had to maintain my composure, and I have done it. I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and I shook like I was sitting in a cold river. Then I made a plan. The first thing I did was call a man I used to work with, retired now, lives up near Gainesville. His name is Howard. He worked financial crimes for the GBI for 30 years. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You got chain of custody on any of that?" I told him about Owen, about the storage unit, about the laptop. He said, "Okay, don't touch anything else, don't move the bin. I'm going to call someone." The second thing I did was drive to the storage unit the next morning with Howard and a woman he brought, an active GBI agent named Whitmore. She was about 40, wore no expression I could read. She photographed everything in the bin before any of us touched it. She took possession of the laptop and the manila envelope. She let me keep the notebook because it was already in my hands. The third thing I did was the hardest. I said nothing to Renata. What I haven't told you yet is that Philip came to my house. It was 9 days after the funeral, a Saturday afternoon. He rang the doorbell, and when I opened the door, he was standing there with a casserole dish covered in foil. He said Renata had made it. She wanted me to have food. I thanked him. I took the dish. He didn't leave. He stood on my front porch and looked at me in a way that I can only describe as measuring, like he was taking my temperature. He said, "Have you heard from anyone about Marcus's apartment? The landlord or anyone?" My stomach turned to stone. I said, "No." "Why?" He said Marcus had some things he was storing there, work files, personal stuff, said he wanted to make sure they were handled properly, that there weren't sensitive documents floating around, company proprietary information. I looked at him. I said, "I'll let you know if I hear anything." He nodded. He said, "You doing okay, Lorraine?" And then he stopped. Because my name isn't Lorraine, he knows my name, he's known my name for 6 years, and he'd just called me by the wrong one entirely. He tried to cover it with a small laugh, said he was exhausted, wasn't sleeping well. I told him I understood. I closed the door. I went to my phone and I called Howard. Here is what the investigation found over the following 6 weeks. Philip had been stealing from Hargrove and Briggs for almost 2 years. The total came to just under $340,000. Funneled through the Shell LLC he'd registered in Delaware under his mother's maiden name. He'd used a portion of the money to service a private debt, not a loan shark in the street sense, but a private lending arrangement with a man who had a history of financial fraud convictions and operated what amounted to a predatory lending business out of an office at Alpharetta. Philip had borrowed heavily from him 2 years prior, apparently to cover gambling debts he'd accumulated, and the pressure to repay had escalated. Marcus had found the discrepancy in the audit cycle. He had confronted Philip. He had started building the documentation folder. The medical examiner's original finding was cardiac event, cause undetermined. After the GBI opened an inquiry and requested a secondary toxicology panel, the kind not included in a standard workup, they found a compound called digoxin. It's a heart medication. In therapeutic doses, it manages heart rhythm. In the amount found in Marcus's system, it causes the heart to stop. It can look exactly like a sudden cardiac event. It is very difficult to detect without specifically testing for it. Someone had to know that. I spent 4 hours in a room at the GBI field office in Decatur, giving a statement. Howard sat outside in the hall. I walked out of there and he handed me a coffee, and I drank it standing in the parking lot in November with my coat half buttoned, and I let myself cry for the first time since they buried my son. I have to tell you about Renata. She is my daughter, and I love her completely, and I will never be finished with the grief of what I had to watch her go through when they arrested Philip on a Thursday evening in the parking lot of the Kroger on Flat Shoals Road. She called me from the parking lot. She was crying in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a little girl. She kept saying she didn't understand. I drove to her, and I sat with her in her car in that parking lot for 2 hours, and I told her everything. All of it. Marcus's notebook, the storage unit, the toxicology, all of it. She didn't speak for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "He killed my brother." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you knew?" I said I'd known for 6 weeks. I told her I was sorry. I told her I had needed to be sure before I broke her world apart, and that I needed to let the investigators do their work without Philip knowing. She looked at me, and I didn't know what she was going to say. She said, "Mama, you did right." Philip was indicted on 1 count of wire fraud, 1 count of securities fraud, and 1 count of first-degree murder. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial is pending. I don't know what will happen. I know what the evidence shows. What I want to say, the reason I'm telling you this, is not to talk about Philip. is to talk about the Thursday phone call. Marcus called me on a Thursday, and he told me to look in his office, top right drawer. He was trying to leave me a trail. He didn't say it plainly because maybe he was scared of what he'd set in motion, or maybe he thought nothing would actually happen. Maybe he thought I'd never need to use the information. I almost didn't go to that storage unit. Owen called me on a number I didn't recognize, and for a split second I thought about not answering. How many times in your life do you make a choice like that without knowing what it is? I think about that moment a lot. I also think about the fact that I spent 22 years doing investigations and I still almost missed it. I let myself be talked out of my own instincts for 2 weeks after his death. Because grief does that. It makes you distrust yourself. It makes you think the thing you're feeling is just pain looking for a target. If something feels wrong after you lose someone, trust that feeling. Get someone who knows how to look. Protect the evidence. And do not, no matter how much you want to confront the person directly, no matter how angry you are, do not do it alone and unwired. I know better. I've known better for 20 years, and I still had to remind myself. Marcus Allen would have been 35 in March. He liked pineapple on pizza, which was a personal failing I teased him about every time. He wore the same style of New Balance sneakers for 15 years. He called me every Sunday at noon. I keep my phone on loud now, even at night, even when I'm sleeping. I don't know what I'm sleeping. I don't know what I'm waiting for. I know it won't ring. But it took me 63 years to understand that some habits of love are not about logic. They are about the part of you that will not stop reaching for the person who is gone. I carry his notebook in my bag. The composition notebook, the black and white one. I know the investigators have the photocopies. I know it's all logged in the evidence file, but the handwriting is his. And some things you don't let go of. I've been sitting with this story for months now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not what I want it to have taught me. Not some clean, comfortable lesson, but what it actually did to the way I understand the world. Here's what I keep coming back to. Philip didn't become the man who poisoned my son overnight. That's not how it works. It started with a gambling debt he was too proud to admit, then a private loan he was too scared to ask for help with, then a small theft he told himself he'd pay back, then a larger one, then the thing he needed to protect. Not just the money, not just his freedom, but the version of himself he'd been performing for 6 years at my dinner table. Every step followed the one before it with its own terrible logic, and Marcus, who was meticulous and honest and called his mother every Sunday, stumbled into the middle of that chain and became the thing that had to be removed. I'm not saying this to make anyone feel sympathy for Philip. I'm saying it because I think people misunderstand how these situations happen. They imagine a monster who woke up one day and decided to do monstrous things. But what I saw in those documents, in Marcus's careful notes, in those wire transfer records, was an ordinary man who made a series of choices he thought were reversible, until they weren't. Until the cost of stopping was higher than the cost of continuing, and then the cost of continuing required my son's life. That's the thing about the choices we make when no one is watching. They don't stay private. They grow. They demand more and more from us until they demand something we never intended to give. Marcus saw it clearly. He was 22 years younger than me, and he saw it before I did. He documented everything. He tried to give the man a chance to stop. And when that didn't work, he built a trail for someone else to follow, because he understood that truth has to be handed forward. It doesn't carry itself. I think about the version of me that didn't answer Owen's call, that almost me who saw an unknown number and let it ring. I think about how easily this story could have ended differently. Philip walking free, Renata living the rest of her life beside the man who killed her brother, me growing old with a grief I couldn't explain and a suspicion I couldn't prove. One answered phone call. That's the distance between those two versions of this story. What I want to say to anyone carrying that kind of gut feeling, the one that doesn't have evidence yet, the one people around you will call paranoia, is this: your instincts were built from everything you've ever witnessed and survived. They are not nothing. They are data you haven't organized yet. Trust them enough to make the call. Find the right person to help you look. Protect what you find. And don't go alone into a room with someone you believe has already decided what you're worth. I know better. I've known better for decades. I'm telling you anyway because knowing and doing are two entirely different things, and grief has a way of making you doubt yourself at precisely the moment you need yourself most. Marcus left me a trail because he trusted that I would follow it. The least I can do is follow it all the way to the end, and then turn around and tell you where it led.